The European Scramble for Africa, also known as the Partition of Africa, refers to the period during the late 19th century when European powers rapidly colonized and divided the African continent. This period, spanning roughly from the 1880s to the start of World War I in 1914, saw unprecedented and aggressive territorial claims by European nations, fundamentally reshaping Africa's political, economic, and social landscape. The primary motivation behind the Scramble for Africa was economic. European nations were amid the Industrial Revolution and required new sources of raw materials to fuel their factories and new markets to sell their goods. Africa, rich in resources such as gold, diamonds, rubber, and agricultural products, presented a lucrative opportunity for exploitation. Additionally, the decline of the Atlantic slave trade prompted European powers to seek alternative economic ventures in Africa. Political and strategic considerations also played a significant role in the Scramble for Africa. European powers were engaged in intense rivalries, and colonial expansion was seen as a means to increase national prestige and power. Control over African territories was also strategic for securing key naval bases and trade routes, particularly around the Mediterranean and East Africa's coasts. The Berlin Conference of 1884-1885 was a pivotal event in the Scramble for Africa. Convened by German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, the conference aimed to regulate European colonization and trade in Africa, thereby avoiding conflict among the European powers. The resulting General Act of the Berlin Conference established rules for the partitioning of Africa, including the principle of effective occupation, which required powers to demonstrate their control over a territory before claiming it. The division of Africa often occurred with little regard for existing ethnic, cultural, or political boundaries. European powers drew arbitrary borders that split ethnic groups and merged diverse communities into single colonies. This lack of consideration for local realities sowed the seeds for future conflicts and tensions, which continue to affect many African nations to this day. Colonial administrations varied widely across Africa, but they generally shared certain characteristics. European powers imposed their political systems, legal frameworks, and economic structures on the colonized territories. They also introduced new forms of labor exploitation, such as forced labor and cash crop agriculture, which disrupted traditional economies and ways of life. The impact of the Scramble for Africa on the continent's societies was profound. Traditional power structures were dismantled or co-opted, and European missionaries and educators promoted Western values and Christianity, often at the expense of indigenous cultures and religions. The introduction of new technologies and infrastructure, such as railways and telegraphs, facilitated the extraction of resources and the consolidation of colonial rule. Resistance to European colonization was widespread across Africa. Many African societies mounted armed resistance against the invaders, using both conventional and guerrilla tactics. Some notable examples include the Zulu resistance in southern Africa, led by King Cetshwayo, and the Mahdist uprising in Sudan. However, the superior military technology and organization of the European forces often led to the defeat of African resistance. The exploitation of Africa's resources had devastating environmental and economic consequences. European colonizers prioritized resource extraction over sustainable development, leading to environmental degradation and the depletion of valuable resources. The imposition of cash crop economies disrupted local food production, contributing to famines and economic dependency. Colonial education policies were designed to serve the needs of the colonial administrations rather than to empower the African populations. Education systems were often limited and biased towards producing a small elite who could assist in the administration, while the majority of the population received little or no education. This contributed to long-term socioeconomic disparities. The legacy of the Scramble for Africa is complex and multifaceted. On the one hand, the colonial period brought about some infrastructural and administrative developments. On the other hand, the arbitrary borders and exploitative policies of the colonial powers left a legacy of political instability, economic underdevelopment, and social divisions that many African countries continue to grapple with. Decolonization in the mid-20th century saw the emergence of independent African states, but the process was often marred by violence and political turmoil. The new nations inherited the problematic borders and administrative structures established during the colonial period, which posed significant challenges to nation building and governance. The Scramble for Africa also had significant repercussions for Europe. The colonial empires became sources of national pride and economic gain. but they also entangled European powers in complex colonial conflicts and rivalries. The competition for African territories contributed to the tensions that eventually led to World War I. In contemporary times, the effects of the Scramble for Africa are still visible. Many African nations are working to overcome the legacies of colonialism by addressing issues such as ethnic conflict, economic dependency, and political instability. Efforts towards regional integration, such as those by the African Union, aim to foster unity and cooperation among African states. The history of the Scramble for Africa is a stark reminder of the impacts of imperialism and colonization. It underscores the importance of understanding historical contexts in addressing present-day challenges and highlights the resilience and agency of African societies in the face of profound external pressures. 4.0